to welcome you again to this fourth annual Palestine Forum. My name is Kharroub. I currently serve as the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I have been asked to moderate this panel, this symposium titled U.S. Policy Toward Palestine, Domestic and International Implications. The symposium will include 4 presentations by our 4-member team from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. to cover various aspects of this very complicated issue. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes. We have some time to deliver his or her remarks about their specific assigned subtopic, to be followed by a Q&A session to give members of the audience the opportunity to raise their own questions and delve deeper into discussions with the presenters. Please, those who choose to ask questions, please ask your questions from the 2 podiums on the side of the room here, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. I would like to also remind you that try to make your questions as direct as possible, and if you'd like to direct specific questions to specific presenters, please do so. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleagues and their assigned topics. Khalil Jahshan, who is the Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., will be talking about Trump and the Palestine question, the pursuit of hegemony in the region. Tamara, who is Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at ACW, she will focus her remarks on Palestine and the Democratic Party crisis, drivers and impacts of shifts in U.S. public opinion and discourse. Yousef Munayyer, he's the head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow at ACW. His presentation is titled The Paradigm Shift, the Groundwork for a New American Politics About Palestine. Hanna, Alshaikh, she is a Palestine program coordinator and fellow at ACW. Hanna will speak on Palestine and the reshaping of the U.S. institutional order. Khalil, please.
Thank you, Imad. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and had a good enough lunch to sustain yourself with a topic like the one we are going to be tackling, dealing with Trump and his policies on the Palestine issue. As all of you know, this past Tuesday, January 20th, Donald Trump celebrated the completion of his first year as 47th President of the United States. In this symposium, we will discuss his administration's main stand on Palestine and explore whether his policies or the policies that he pursued throughout his tenure as president are a passing phase in American politics or a long-term trend that may eventually become institutionalized in U.S. policy towards the region. We will briefly examine the content, rationale, and broader political implications of Trump's Palestine policy, including the main objectives of his current unfolding 20-point ceasefire plan for governance and reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, through which he is promising to somehow not only resolve or end the war in Gaza, but resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict altogether and determine the future of Palestine as a whole. I would like to begin with a few brief remarks on Trump's foreign policy in general, because his stance on Palestine and his overall Middle East policy are not formulated or implemented in a political vacuum. Both are part and parcel of an aggressive, personalized, reckless, somewhat imperial, media-hyped, and to put it mildly, highly unconventional approach that marks a substantive as well as stylistic change in U.S. foreign policy making as it has developed in the years since World War II. Historically, U.S. foreign policy, as most experts on the region, on the U.S. would tell you, has been guided by a set of bipartisan endorsed core interests aimed at securing the country, the United States, by safeguarding its borders against external aggression, advancing its strategic objectives, including securing economic prosperity and military dominance over its enemies, real or perceived, and guaranteeing the security and stability of both international allies and world regions that are deemed strategic to the United States. In addition, there is a whole assortment of other principles, values, and commitments that haphazardly appear once in a while on America's political radar. Among them, the worldwide promotion of democracy that you hear American presidents and secretaries of states and so on brag about all the time, and human rights in general, and a clean environment for the world. Although these national interests have been modified sporadically to accommodate both domestic and international developments affecting Washington's relations with the world, the overall list has remained relatively intact for decades. Any occasional shuffling by successive U.S. administrations has affected the order of these priorities rather than the actual content in a radical way. But as a Washington outsider, Mr. Trump considered this foreign policy paradigm to be archaic and ineffective. Even before he won his first race in 2016, he refused to play the game by its established rules. Indeed, he despised the political system and continues to do so, even though he wanted to control the system, but he did despise it, because he felt it was dominated by petty politics from his perspective as the way he sees himself as a major world player in business, and focused essentially on what he also perceived as insignificant pursuits. Trump's contempt and defiance ripped up both, by the way, domestic and foreign policy norms alike. Throughout his first term in office as the 45th president, that's going back to 2017 through 2021, and since the beginning of his current second term, Trump displayed little patience with the conventional core interests and values of foreign policy that were previously sacrosanct to many presidents before him. Without much political fanfare, he replaced them with a combination of a zero-sum thinking, combative power politics, a personalized, transactional style of deal-making, and his own unique mishmash of undisciplined populism and American nationalism that's encapsulated by the slogan, America First. Trump's political mindset clearly is not, he is not a typical American politician who built his professional career in Washington, D.C. As a businessman and media personality, Trump's wealth positions him as part of America's financial elite, no doubt about it. Yet the ruling class in America widely deems him as an outsider. He's not accepted. And this is some of the reasons why he takes it personal in terms of his animosity toward the political elite of the country. In turn, Trump despises the established elite and has sought to manipulate and control its members through bullying and deal-making, or a combination of the two, to serve both his own personal financial interests and those of his friends and associates. Tension between Mr. Trump and the established political and bureaucratic elite in the formal institutions of government, whether Democratic or Republican alike, persists today as we speak. He continues to reduce the impact of the political elite on decision-making and marginalizes their influence on policy outcomes. Under Donald Trump, gone are the constitutional constraints on executive power, including the constitutionally mandated equality with the other branches of government, i.e. the legislative and the judiciary. Gone are the conventional tools of diplomacy, including, by the way, the State Department, in case you wonder what happened to our State Department, which is now only a shadow of its former self. The Secretary of State today has been effectively reduced to the status of a national security advisor who acts at the behest of the White House rather than as the President's chief foreign policy advisor. Gone, as you all well know, USAID, the Agency for International Development, with its humanitarian aid as a once vital component of US foreign policy. Gone also is the lip service paid to the promotion of democracy, human rights, and economic cooperation, peace building, environmental protection, even if these were mostly pro forma commitments from previous administrations. Gone is American cooperation with the international community in numerous vital areas as the US administration withdraws from dozens of non-governmental organizations, the results of which became apparent this week with basically the President initiating the Board of Peace, which he hopes will even replace the United Nations itself. And finally, gone are traditional alliances, such as, and this is a message for this region in the world, such alliances as NATO, traditionally much more important than this region for the United States, which look as if they will be somehow replaced ad hoc in a transactional partnership typical of Mr. Trump. And the way he deals with these important issues is kind of very unique. We have to put up with his compulsive and rambling post on his Truth social media platform. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Trump's concept of America first. Frankly, the current Trumpian slogan, America first, that I just mentioned is the only way to understand President Trump's antagonistic speech that we all witnessed at Davos this week. The United States, as he said, wants Greenland and will eventually take it over from Denmark one way or the other. For Trump, it really is America first, above all allies, above all treaties, above all commitments and consideration. So the $64,000 question, as we say in the States, that worries many political analysts, including yours truly, is when will President Trump apply his Greenland foreign policy model, or that, worse, of Venezuela, to other parts of the world, including where we stand today, the Middle East. Despite his supposedly pragmatic, non-ideological background, Donald J. Trump took sides with Israel way before he started his political career, before he even delved into American national politics. His business background in New York brought him in close association with many colleagues, partners, employees that identified with Zionism and pro-Israel positions. These business associates clearly helped mold Trump's perception of the Middle East in general. Although the State of Israel has had many friendly presidents in Washington who catered to its whims and demands over the years, whether or not they were justified, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly described Mr. Trump, and I'm quoting him, as Israel's greatest friend. And he credited him for having, as he said it in his own words, done more for Israel in the past decade than any other American president ever. Under Trump, U.S. policy contributions or concessions to Israel included, to name a few, the following. One, I'm sure you all remember the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital back on December 6, 2017, the decision to move the embassy, the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which began on March of 2019, the acknowledgement the same month of Israel's claims of sovereignty over the Syrian Golan Heights, with implications that the same applies to the West Bank, the jettisoning of the position held by successive U.S. administrations before him, going back to 1967, essentially that settlements in the West Bank are illegal, then became harmful to peace efforts, and then became inconsistent with international law. He didn't care for any of these. Fourth, the decision to distance the United States from developing closer relationship with the Palestinian government or Palestinian Authority by closing down the PLO diplomatic mission in 2018 and cutting U.S. funding for various Palestinian NGOs and versus also UN NGOs, including UNRWA. Fifth, the release of his Peace to Prosperity plan back in 2020, allowing Israel the option of granting Palestinians local autonomy on the West Bank in return for annexing 30% of that occupied territory. Sixth, the campaign to pressure the PA and the PLO, trying to prevent them from pursuing any legal venue at all around the world, including the International Criminal Court, any UN agency, the International Court of Justice, to bring about Israeli abuses of Palestinian rights, political or human rights. Seven, the presentation of the Abraham Accords back in, again, September 15, 2020, as the centerpiece, and it has been the centerpiece of U.S. policy since then in the region, and to pressure actively important U.S. allies in the region to kind of condition their good relations with the U.S. on the basis of their normalizing relations with Israel. 8, increasing U.S. military aid to Israel, even resuming some weapons system that the previous administration denied Israel because of abuses in Gaza. 9, the recent appointment that we witnessed this week, the celebration of formalizing it, back in January 16, 2026, of the Board of Peace, which essentially calls for the demilitarization, reconstruction, and the governing of the Gaza Strip. So clearly, based on this long list of favorable policies in support of Israel, Mr. Trump has clearly earned his credentials as Israel's greatest ever friend at the White House. His political bias is pronounced, it's provocative, and unrelenting. The war in Gaza since October 7, 2023, gave him a golden opportunity to display that bias in no uncertain terms, rendering the United States an active partner to Israel in its pursuit of the permanent domination of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of its civilian population, and in preventing the emergence of an independent Palestinian state in any part of Palestine. That brings us back to the current situation with regards to the peace plan, so-called ceasefire plan, the 20-point ceasefire plan. Let me quickly summarize it as follows. President Trump's plan to end the genocidal war in Gaza is neither a cohesive plan nor a diplomatic framework for a serious political agreement. Some of us who have been in this line of work for many, many years, we have witnessed dozens of peace processes in the Middle East and have participated in discussing and in basically advising in terms of the content of these plans in the past. This one doesn't even resemble anything we have seen in the past. It is a half-baked political document that lacks details and has enough gaps to hinder its own full implementation. The 20-point plan, touted by the White House as a plan aimed at achieving a historic and comprehensive peace throughout the Middle East, not just Gaza, is purely a media hype that stands little chance at prompt and full implementation, as borne out by the events on the ground over the past 4 months. From a Palestinian perspective, 3 major objections to the plan stand out. 1, from its very inception, the architects of the plan sought to absent the Palestinians from the process and minimize their role in its proceedings. What we have witnessed this week is a case in point. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict, ladies and gentlemen, was not named as such by accident. It is a conflict created by the dispossession and dispersion of the Palestinian people, whose role in determining their own future is universally acknowledged. That role should be central and all-encompassing within any peace process, and not limiting that role to narrow technocratic tasks. 2, the plan has acknowledged the need to stop the 2-year genocidal war in Gaza and tone down its earlier demands for the total ethnic cleansing of the civilian population. However, it is not at all clear about continuing the retail ethnic cleansing or ending Israeli occupation itself according to a given schedule. Even today's remarks by Kushner did not clarify this point as to when does he expect the Israelis to withdraw. So consequently, Israeli occupation forces remain in military control of an estimated 50 to 60% of the Strip as we speak. Third and last, any plan that seeks to end war in Gaza or elsewhere needs to provide for a viable permanent peace. The Trump plan did mention de-radicalization, release of hostages, aid distribution, governance, stabilization of the Strip, redevelopment and reconstruction of the area in its early phases. The first, I would say, let's say 12 points in that 20-point plan. But somehow, it chose to relegate the issue of peace, that political horizon, as they refer to it. Somehow, that political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence was relegated to the last point in the plan. And that tells us exactly the motives of this administration. Due to the lack of time, I'm going to skip what was announced earlier in terms of my remarks. Will include a reference to MAGA and its relationship with Trump. However, I'm more than glad to discuss that with you during the Q&A session that will follow the presentations by my 3 other colleagues. Thank you for your attention. Tamara?
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be focusing on the Democratic Party in the United States, more specifically in my remarks. In the first weeks of Israel's genocide in Gaza, a group of US diplomats at the State Department submitted a formal dissent memo warning that unconditional backing of Israel would fuel humanitarian disasters and damage US credibility. But the Biden administration refused to change its policy. Arms provisions would continue, and ceasefire efforts at the UN would be blocked, despite growing dissatisfaction with Biden's handling of the conflict. When Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee in 2024 for the presidential elections, many voters expected a shift in policy, but she maintained Biden's approach. The Democratic Convention's refusal to allow a Palestinian-American speaker became emblematic of the Democratic Party's failure. The political costs became very clear after the elections. 29% of Biden's 2020 voters who did not vote for Harris in 2024 said their top reason was the genocide in Gaza, more than the economy, more than immigration or healthcare. In the battleground states that flipped from Biden in 2020 to Trump in 2024, 1 in 5 voters cited Gaza as their decisive issue. In the end, Harris lost 6 million votes than Biden had in 2020. And the genocide in Gaza was a central reason. Not because foreign policy decides elections, but because millions of Democratic voters felt that their party had abandoned its moral authority. The Democratic Party, which evolved over time into a liberal coalition focused on economic equality, civil rights, and justice, has time and again failed when it comes to Palestine. But this is not just a policy failure. It is now an identity crisis within the party, a widening rupture between the Democratic voters' demands and what the Democratic leaders are willing to say or do when it comes to Palestine. But this crisis did not appear over time, and it did not start with the 2024 presidential elections. It has been decades in the making. I will briefly outline 3 moments in the party's history that reveal this trajectory in Democratic Party politics, and I will discuss its significance for policies towards Palestine. Those 3 moments include Jesse Jackson's race in 1988, Bernie Sanders in 2016, and Kamala Harris in 2024, when Democratic Party leaders deliberately turned away from justice, dismissed public opinion and sentiments, and abandoned their own stated principles. First, the Jesse Jackson Democratic presidential nomination and campaign in 2028 exceeded all expectations for a progressive candidate and was unprecedented with regard to statements on Palestine. Jackson spoke about the occupation and challenged unconditional support for Israel, and he garnered a sizable base of supporters. His campaign won 13 state contests, 6.9 million votes, close to 30% of the delegates, and included language on Palestinian rights and self-determination in 10 state party platforms for the first time. Although his Palestine plank did not make it to the final Democratic national platform, the Jackson campaign succeeded in bringing the first ever debate on Palestinian rights to the floor of the Democratic National Convention. It forced the Democratic Party to move away from its no-talk policy on Palestine and shattered the silence. But the reaction from party leadership was swift and aggressive. Jackson was smeared as reckless and dangerous and was accused of threatening party unity. This small opening in the Democratic Party, the mere discussion of recognizing Palestinians as human beings, became a source of worry for pro-Israel Democrats. It triggered an intense counter-revolution by both the party elites and the Israel lobby. The decades that followed saw increased monetary, military, and diplomatic support for Israeli policies within the party, while engaging in empty rhetoric about the peace process. This all culminating in President Obama signing the largest military aid package to Israel in US history. Which brings me to the second milestone in the Democratic Party and the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. Democratic voters who were disappointed by Obama's establishment policies and failure to effect the change he had promised were energized and motivated by the Sanders campaign. Young voters who were raised on social media saw Israel and the occupation for what they are. By the time Bernie Sanders ran in 2016, the gap between the base and the leadership was deepening even further. And although Sanders' foreign policy platform was thin at the time, and his views on Palestine were far from revolutionary, he was the first mainstream candidate to talk about Palestinian rights and criticize Israel. For the first time in history, the Democratic National Platform included the recognition of Palestinian independence, sovereignty, and dignity. But yet again, the party leadership was not pleased. Even though polling was showing Sanders to be more electable than Hillary Clinton against a Republican candidate, and in fact, the most electable presidential candidate in either party, the Democratic Party leaders worked aggressively to marginalize Sanders through tactics like superdelegates, debate scheduling, and media narratives, and email leaks showed staff discussing ways to undermine him. Stopping Sanders became the new unifying priority for party elites. But the Bernie effect persisted. He also succeeded in creating a significant shift in the Democratic Party. First, his campaign intensified sentiments of disillusionment among voters and distrust in party institutions. But more importantly, Sanders brought progressive issues to the national public mainstream agenda. He was able to move the party leftward, not only on domestic issues, but also on Palestine. He made recognition of Palestinian rights and criticism of Israel mainstream in democratic politics, and thus paved the way for progressive Democrats to be elected to Congress in the midterm elections in 2018, such as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and other members of the squad. And the third and final moment or milestone I want to discuss is this era of genocide. In 2024, the Democratic Party, the party of justice, totally lost its credibility when there was a Democrat president, Joe Biden, who presided over the genocide of our time. The party's refusal to reconsider its genocidal policies in Gaza and unconditional support for Israel, in defiance of not only international law, but also US laws, US freedoms, US democracy, and what democratic voters want, has exposed a deep disconnect between the party leadership and its base, between the party policies and its professed principles. By 2024, it had become clear that the tide was turning. Polling showed majorities of Democrats, 59%, expressed greater sympathy for Palestinians than for Israel at 21%. 77% of Democrats said Israel is committing genocide, and 75% of Democrats opposed sending additional military aid to Israel. 78% of Democrats support recognition of the state of Palestine. This was a turning point for the Democratic Party that ultimately led, among other things, to Zahran Mamdani's victory in the New York City mayoral candidate race, even though the party leadership still withheld their endorsement after he won the primary. But this victory showed that explicit support for Palestinian rights can actually mobilize and not turn away voters in the Democratic Party. At the same time, other dynamics were taking place that reflect the shift within the party. In Congress, progressive Democrats have pushed measures to restrict US weapons transfers to Israel, such as Bernie Sanders' resolution, which was backed by over half of the Senate Democrats, the Block the Bombs bill in the House of Representatives that has nearly 50 co-sponsors. These developments provide evidence of a growing mid-level progressive bloc in the Democratic Party, despite resistance from the leadership. And ahead of this year's midterm elections, pro-Israel incumbents are already facing primary challenges in places like New Jersey and New York. and additional contests are being organized in Michigan, Illinois, and elsewhere by Justice Democrats and pro-Palestine candidates. The Palestine issue has become a litmus test in the Democratic Party. We now have half of the voters saying they would never support a candidate who is backed by pro-Israel lobby groups like AIPAC. The Democratic Party's strategy and performance in the 2026 midterms and the 2028 presidential elections will be pivotal, not only for the future of the party, but also for the United States and arguably the world. Whether Zohran Mamdani's victory will be replicated remains to be seen. But we know for now there are significant trends within the Democratic Party that I argue are irreversible and consequential. One, we have a growing liberal, progressive, and young electorate that is anchored in value-based and justice-centered politics and has grown increasingly sympathetic to Palestinians and critical of Israeli policies and US support for Israel. This stands in sharp contrast to the positions of party leadership and the larger establishment. The second trend is a changed information ecosystem that has challenged the establishment narrative. What we now have is an American public that is shocked to learn for the first time about the oppression of the Palestinians and about the outsized influence of the Israel lobby in US politics. They have witnessed a genocide live-streamed in real time in the palms of their hands, and this they cannot unsee. There are already efforts to counter these narratives, and I can talk about that during the discussion if there's interest. But moving on to the third trend, we have a growing class of mid-level progressive Democrats who run for office, win elections, and serve in Congress that have been slowly moving the party to the left and in support of Palestinian rights. While their influence remains limited compared to the top party leadership, they are growing in numbers and support and are expected to mobilize and continue to challenge traditional pro-Israel party figures. In closing, the Palestine issue has moved from the margins to the center of the Democratic Party contestation. It has become more than just a foreign policy issue, but a barometer of democratic values and of the party's commitment to justice, alternative to authoritarianism and Trumpism. Democrats would need to articulate a vision that rejects complicity in violence and centers human rights across domestic and foreign policy. The longer party leaders cling to the status quo, the more they alienate disaffected voters and risk more losses in 2016 and 2028. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yousef Munayyer, the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. I want to just begin by thanking the organizers of this important gathering. It's an honor to be participating once again in the annual Palestine Forum. My comments today are entitled Paradigm Shift, the Groundwork for New American Politics Around Palestine. I emphasize groundwork precisely because I believe we're at the early stages of what can be a substantial paradigm shift, and while several pieces are starting to fall into place to move in this direction, it is yet to be seen and far from guaranteed that it will ultimately come to fruition. At the outset, I want to recognize the context for this moment. We gather after more than 2 years of genocide in Gaza, a genocide that is still going on, albeit in a modified form. But I also want to emphasize that the stirrings of this groundwork for a new American politics were not created by the genocide in Gaza, they rather pre-existed it, but they were also significantly catalyzed by it. I will discuss three major dimensions which have contributed to this groundwork from which a new politics can spring, what kind of coalitions could potentially emerge from them, and what sort of policy objectives such coalitions could realistically focus on. These three dimensions are the value-based coalition on the left, which Tamara discussed, the Trump effect and the changing coalition on the right, and also the crisis of AIPAC and the Israel lobby. First, the values-based coalition on the left, broadly speaking. Today, there exists on the left half of the political spectrum in the United States unprecedented, unfavorable attitudes towards Israel, sympathy for Palestinians, and the desire to see policy change when it comes to U.S. support for Israel. Public opinion polls, and Tamara shared some of the numbers, have reflected this time and again, especially so after the genocide in Gaza began. Here, though, the genesis is deeper. We began to see shifts in this direction nearly 15 years ago, shaped in part by a growing post-9/11 skepticism of U.S. militarism embodied in the Bush administration and the John McCain presidential campaigns, which also had a carryover effect into skepticism of Israeli militarism as well. In addition to this, narratives around power and justice had resonance among the left side of the political spectrum, which easily understood the Palestinian struggle in the frame of civil rights, international law, human rights, and racial justice. Over a decade ago, while working in Palestine organizing in the United States, my colleagues and I were excited when liberal Democrats, a subset of Democrats, had for the first time registered as more sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis in an opinion poll. This was but an early but important marker of change to come. We thought about what it might look like if this sentiment spread to all Democrats and not just the most liberal among them. At the same time, while the left was becoming more sympathetic to Palestinians, the right was moving in the opposite direction. Given this, it felt reasonable at the time to concentrate on building from the left into the center, since the right was unwelcoming of our agenda. We'll speak more about the right in a moment. What has changed so importantly today on the left is not merely that the numbers have shifted so significantly that sympathy for Palestinians is now a mainstream position on the left, but more importantly, Palestine is increasingly becoming a litmus test and a prism through which Americans on the left view a candidate's authenticity. Key actors in the Democratic coalition, from youth movements to campus organizing to labor unions to progressive elected officials, are strong allies on the issue of Palestine. What the genocide in Gaza catalyzed in this space was the extent of involvement in these different components of the coalition among previously unengaged actors. That mass participation and mainstreaming contributed to a breaking of fear, of intimidation and silencing, which we will also address shortly. Moving forward, the growing Palestine solidarity on the left in U.S. politics can rely on several strengths, including moral coherence, generational depth, and cultural influence. The challenges it faces, however, and overcoming them will be of equal importance, and these include being able to translate opinion shifts into electoral change, dealing with internal fragmentation, and also repression from the top of institutions still controlled by a small but powerful minority. On its own and in the short term, there's little that one side of the spectrum can accomplish on its own when it comes to genuine policy change. But today, for the first time, we are seeing shifts on the right, which can perhaps translate into new possibilities that were not imagined before. This brings us to the second of these three dimensions, the Trump effect and fractures within the Republican coalition. Again, in this dimension, the changes which appear to be fast-moving today did not start today, but have rather been accelerated by other factors, including the genocide and the broader crisis in the region. But the seeds of these fractures in the Republican coalition go back to 2015, when Trump first announced his foray into presidential politics. At the time, Republicans had lost 2 elections in a row, with candidates like John McCain and Mitt Romney, who both typified and seem poised to continue the foreign policy priorities of the George W. Bush administrations. But that foreign policy, which entangled the United States in what became known as forever wars, became increasingly unpopular. While anti-Muslim sentiment and general suspicion of all things non-white would continue to be important on the American right, the idea of fighting long drawn-out wars in Muslim countries was not popular. Nor were the proponents of such endeavors, like the Marco Rubios, the Jeb Bushes, the Newt Gingriches, and they were not able to capture the Republican Party. Trump understood that building a winning coalition on the right could be done, but not with this foreign policy at its center. It could keep the anti-Muslim and frankly white supremacist inclinations, but under a more isolationist America First outlook. By assembling a coalition along these terms, Trump was able to keep white evangelicals, the base of the party, active and committed, but he was also able to win a strain of important voters that would allow him to reach beyond what McCain and Romney could reach, specifically an electoral majority. In fact, during his first campaign, the biggest pro-Israel donors in the United States, the Adelson family, first backed Marco Rubio, not Trump. It was only when Trump proved that he could win without their support that they invested in his campaign for fear of not being in his good graces. Trump was a unique candidate who could keep such a coalition viable, but it's hard to imagine another candidate who could do the same. It's precisely because of that this uneasy marriage now seems headed for a messy divorce, as the Republican Party begins to imagine its post-Trump future. When it comes to Israel, one side among these dueling Republican factions sees Israel positively, through both an evangelical and national security lens. For some, supporting Israel and its domination of Palestinians is a divine command. For others, Israel is a strategic partner and an asset in a civilizational struggle against Islam in the East. But the other side is far more skeptical. They increasingly see Israel not only as a burden on the United States, sometimes dragging U.S. blood and treasure into foreign entanglements that serve the Israeli interest and not the American one, but they also resent the role that Israeli influence seems to play in American politics. Importantly, this faction is not opposed to Israel because of what it's doing to Palestinians, but rather because of what they believe Israel is doing to America. Which side will win out, if any at all, is yet to be seen. What is certain is that in the fight for the future of the Republican Party, this issue will not be swept under the table, and it will likely be negotiated in public during a competitive and probably chaotic primary fight. These shifts can perhaps present openings for a new coalition on policy change, but at minimum, they disrupt previous understandings of the politics of this issue in the United States. All of this has AIPAC and the Israel lobby in the United States in a state of bewilderment and maybe even panic. It is this third dimension which we turn to now, the crisis of AIPAC and the Israel lobby. Here, too, the seeds of disruption were planted long before the start of the genocide in Gaza, and are concurrent with the other shifts we've covered above. For pro-Israel interest groups, the easiest conditions for them to pursue their agenda are conditions in which American priorities seem to line up with Israeli priorities. The high point for these conditions was the moment after September 11th, 2001. At that time, Benjamin Netanyahu told the New York Times that the events of that day would be a good thing for U.S.-Israel relations. With the U.S. embarking on the morass that would be the global war on terror and Israel focused on repressing the second Palestinian Intifada, the Israel lobby in the United States never had an easier time selling the idea of a U.S.-Israel alliance. But as those conditions changed, so too did the Israel lobby's approach. A former AIPAC director famously quipped that, quote, "A lobby is like a night flower. It thrives in the night, and it withers in the daylight." As we moved further from September 11th, and as Americans grew tired of forever wars they felt lied to about, and as Israel's violent repression of Palestinians seemed less justifiable by the day, AIPAC and the Israel lobby increasingly had to come into the sunlight. In the past, AIPAC prided itself on bipartisan support and influence and electoral discipline. But in recent years, it's become a clear operator on the right, which gets involved in elections in unprecedented and overt ways. Coming out into the sunlight means that more people than ever before are asking questions about the role of pro-Israel influence in American politics, tracking AIPAC contributions, and demanding even that AIPAC register as a foreign agent. In response to these shifts and broader shifts in public opinion towards greater sympathy with Palestinians, AIPAC and the Israel lobby have placed themselves in an escalating feedback loop which furthers their decline. The way this works is that as public opinion shifts away from Israel, the Israel lobby is increasingly forced to respond to this in overt ways, either through excessive spending to shift electoral outcomes or by advancing repressive measures aimed at stifling dissent. Seeing these actions out in the open, however, the American public grows more suspicious and resentful of the Israel lobby for interference in American politics and efforts to curtail American rights, which in turn feeds the continuing shift in public opinion away from Israel. It's not immediately clear that this ever-escalating feedback loop is escapable or where it will lead, but what is clear is that over time, AIPAC and the Israel lobby has and will increasingly find it harder to dictate outcomes as they have in the past. So can the new groundwork produced by these three dimensions lead to the formation of an actionable coalition to create policy change? This is the key question that must be answered moving forward. The left and the right in the United States rarely agree on anything, and the deep polarization of American politics has touched a wide range of issues, from the economic to the cultural to the foreign policy related. But a rare area where there is growing consensus across the spectrum is on the issue of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Still, there's no shortage of pitfalls here. Can a rights-based constituency on the left, often focused on racial justice, cooperate with those backing white nationalist immigration policies, for example? Can constituencies on the left who spend time and resources defending against smears and accusations of anti-Semitism for their anti-Zionist views consider working in a coalition with actors on the right, among whom too many flirt with actually anti-Semitic narratives? What makes a coalition possible and durable over time is not ideological purity, but rather shared constraints, overlapping interests, and clear winnable demands. If such a coalition was to form, those are the things that it must focus on. Both the America First crowd and the values-based left have a shared interest in shifting the U.S.-Israel relationship to one that is far less biased towards Israel. Neither can really accomplish this on their own. But with the pro-Israel lobby in crisis, the opportunity arises for some sort of collaborative endeavor. Specific policy asks that could hold such a coalition together include, but are not limited to, conditioning or ending military aid to Israel, enforcing U.S. laws on arms transfers and human rights, ending diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations, and protecting free speech and protest rights. Such policy objectives would work because they are easy to understand, can be demanded from institutions, and importantly have cross-ideological appeal. Achieving success here, however, requires more than just identifying the issues that could possibly hold a coalition together. There also needs to be a strategic orientation focused on achieving these changes. This requires shifting from symbolic politics to pressure politics, and also shifting from narrative change to exercising material leverage. Much work has been done on the former, much is left to do on the latter. In conclusion, we are in a transitional moment with new possibilities. The old consensus has shattered, but we're not yet at a stage where a new alignment has consolidated. There is, however, a groundwork from which one can spring. Decisive moments that will play out moving forward are the 2026 midterm elections and then especially the 2028 presidential elections, where the U.S.-Israel relationship is sure to be a topic of contention in previously unimaginable ways. The genocide in Gaza did not start these shifts, but it catalyzed them significantly by laying bare the moral limits of U.S. policy and the structural vulnerabilities of pro-Israel politics to a larger number of Americans than ever before. The question then is not whether American politics on Palestine will change, but who exactly organizes it, around which demands it will revolve, and how long it will take. Thank you.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here with you today. Starting 1 year ago, among the flurry of executive orders and demands from the new administration in Washington, focused on universities. This sweep, which had two key dimensions, one related to immigration and legal status in the United States, and the other related to the standing of universities vis-a-vis the federal government, very plainly sought revenge for the student protest movement against Israel's genocide in Gaza, which reached a peak during the spring 2024 encampment protests seen around the world, and generally speaking, the increased criticism of Israel on university campuses. The administration pursued deportations, as we saw with the kidnapping and detention of Mahmoud Khalil, Rumaisa Azturk, and others. Further, it sought to bar universities from sponsoring all student visas that refused to implement repressive measures designed to crack down on speech critical of Israel and its genocide in Gaza, and revoked funding due to universities' tolerance, whether real or perceived, of the student activism, as well as academic debate, events, and even course offerings on the issue. During the peak of this student activism against the genocide, Arab audiences wanted to know if this movement emerged from a vacuum, who these youth organizers were, and what motivated them to risk their futures to speak out against genocide, and importantly, if this wave of protests would translate to policy change. It was not only the encampments that made international headlines, but also images of masked congressional staff members protesting anonymously on the steps of Congress, of their open letter signed by over 200 staffers, of high-profile resignations at the White House, the Department of Defense, very recently renamed the Department of War, and State Department figures. Indeed, Arab audiences correctly perceived the change in the United States, which is the growing shift in public opinion, right and left, manifested on both the grassroots and official levels, that is increasingly critical of Israel and supportive of Palestinian rights. And I use the term rights in the broadest sense possible to make clear that we should be precise about whose advocacy is contained to human rights, civil rights, and/or religious rights, as opposed to those who take this all a step further to endorse political rights, who recognize the Palestinian struggle as rooted in the Nakba. I also will point out that I distinguish between support for Palestinians in a proactive way from criticism of Israel as a motivating factor behind these expressions of dissent. At the time of these remarkable protests, observers around the world asked variations of a question that can be summarized as follows. Is this a fleeting moment? And can this change be institutionalized? And by institutionalized, I mean here to make these changes formal or permanent, to make them widely accepted norms that shape decision-making, and more specific to this case, embodied by measures such as policy changes. 1 year since President Trump's return to the White House, it is still a worthwhile question to explore. After all, this wave of repression has not won hearts and minds over to Zionism, nor has it reinforced support for the US-Israel alliance. In fact, Israel's genocide in Gaza and the attempts to stifle criticism of the alliance caused many Americans to double down. It has not reversed these strides in US public opinion, and has even caused right-wing media figures to condemn repression that impacts those on the left. And all of this is nothing short of remarkable in a time where US politics is more polarized than ever. In this current American political landscape, Palestine seems to be the only issue in which right and left are moving closer together. Yet it presents a paradox. Washington's unlimited support for Israel and fierce repression of constituent demands to end or at least condition aid to Israel has actually increased support for those demands. And while public opinion shifts, combined with decades of Palestine activism in the United States, should lend themselves to institutionalizing this support, changing laws, or conditioning or ending foreign military financing to Israel, and more, repression of a particularly vulgar and unapologetic nature attempts to make these shifts impossible. This paradox is undeniable under the Biden administration, and as we all know, the Trump administration has intensified this pressure. So on the one hand, we have the right and left constituencies moving towards one another on Palestine, and on the other, Washington has demonstrated that it will resort to repression regardless of who sits in the White House. Despite this rare instance of agreement between the Biden and Trump administrations, we must discuss the critical differences. If Biden's foreign policy and active participation in Israel's genocide signaled the breakdown of the post-World War II international order, Trump's domestic and foreign policies intensify much of what was already underway during the Biden administration. And in this instance, we can think of his crackdown on protest, which blatantly disregards the Constitution, and his Board of Peace, which, as Khalil mentioned, is spoken of sometimes as a potential replacement for the UN, which was established in the aftermath of World War II, as examples. Nonetheless, Trump's repression differs in scale, intensity, and importantly, is part and parcel of a greater unraveling of the US domestic order. The repressive executive orders issued in early 2025 played out in this context of institutional unraveling, of an overhaul of institutions, restructuring many, and eliminating many others. Thus, we saw the shutdown of USAID, of the total overhaul of the State Department and the closure of its departments, and funding cuts across the board for government agencies. Added to this is a crisis of confidence in the resilience of democratic order and constitutional rights. To name only the most prominent example at the moment, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is operating in blatant disregard for judicial orders attempting to limit their activity. While recent polling indicates that Trump still enjoys high levels of popularity among Republican voters, anecdotally, we are beginning to hear that segments of his base are finally beginning to question aspects of his narrative, particularly when it comes to the cost of living crisis in the United States. So how can we shape our expectations in the midst of such uncertainty? One factor to note is that this November, the United States will have its midterm elections, which occur halfway through a president's four-year term. Members of the House of Representatives run for re-election or election following their two-year term, and 1/3 of the Senate runs for election. Midterms essentially represent a referendum on the performance of the sitting president, and based on who controls the bicameral legislature, determines how much restraint or support the president will have in the final 2 years of their term to push their party's agenda. The 2026 midterms will be one of the most consequential elections in US history. Not only will it be a referendum on the presidency, many Americans are now saying that if these elections are not free and fair, and there are concerns about this might just seal the fate of the United States as a republic, as a state of democratic institutions, of constitutional principles, of law and order, for better or for worse. The outcome of those elections, in either case, should provide more useful indications of where US politics are headed. With all of this in mind, it is worth revisiting if the questions that I referenced at the beginning of my remarks, in a moment where protest and public opinion seem to be stripped of their ability to impact policy. And to reiterate, the questions are, is this a fleeting moment, and can this change be institutionalized? I will address this question by advancing two interlinked arguments. First is that this shift is the product of accumulation, and not only a sudden moral awakening for most Americans, although this was the case for many in response to Israel's atrocities in Gaza. Second, the afterlife of this wave of protest and shift in public opinion has institutional consequences. And while we cannot anticipate what the outcome will be in terms of policy moving forward, we are guaranteed that Palestine is a central issue in the domestic US order. Finally, I present my larger argument that Palestine is a domestic issue in the United States, and it has been for decades. And what differs now is American cognizance of this dynamic, and therefore, this change will be institutionalized, again, for better or for worse, and I will elaborate on this point later in my remarks. First, The wave of protest following Israel's genocide was not the beginning of Palestine playing a prominent role in US politics. In fact, Palestine activism has played an important, albeit unwilling, role in defining the limits of US civil liberties. Repression of speech on Palestine has been used as a laboratory for limiting constitutional protected freedoms. Some examples include, under the Nixon administration, it obliged the Anti-Defamation League and AIPAC's demand to surveil and crack down on Arab and Arab American activism. Known as Operation Boulder, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, questioned every Arab on a student visa in the United States regarding their views on Israel. There was a wave of deportations, but not due to any expressed views on Israel, but rather minor technicalities such as violations of work permit authorization. This created a precedent, however, and a framework for the deportation seen later, such as the George W. Bush or Bush the Son's administration, its establishment of the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, or NSEERS program, which led to the surveillance, interrogation, detention, and deportation of immigrants from the Islamic and Arab worlds, and of course, has been reactivated and reworked by the Trump administration. Further public opinion was institutionalized by repression and public opinion before the genocide of Gaza. There is a symbiotic relationship between repression and public opinion gains. Further, worsened conditions on the ground in Palestine often led to engaging more and more Americans. So some examples include, after the 1967 war, the Nakba, which saw the mass expulsion of at least 300,000 Palestinians and the occupation of Palestinian and Arab territory. This led to the establishment of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, or the AAUG, led by Edward Said, Ibrahim Abu Lughod, and other prominent intellectuals. The tripartite aggression on Egypt and Israel's brutal occupation of the Gaza Strip from 1956 to 1957 led to the renewed efforts of the Organization of Arab Students, and the list goes on. Israeli violence in the Second Intifada led to the growth of groups such as the International Solidarity Movement and early iterations of an organization called the Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP. Following Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, where new methods of Israeli sadistic violence against Gaza were put on display, SJP chapters proliferated across college campuses. The successive wars on Gaza in 2012, 2014, and 2021 brought with them increased mobilization of these groups. This period also saw a wave of successful, albeit symbolic, divestment campaigns on college campuses, reaching a peak in the period between 2013 and 2015. In response, a wave of anti-BDS and anti-Palestinian laws aimed at stifling free speech and criminalizing constitutionally protected right to boycott at various levels of government weakened constitutional rights, with very few in the general public taking notice on how this violation of Palestine solidarity activism was ultimately a threat to all Americans. That is until now. We cannot underestimate the consequences of this era that began in the aftermath of Cast Lead. There were at least 200 campus divestment or boycott campaigns, as well as over 300 total BDS victories in the United States between 2005 and the start of the Gaza genocide. It is inevitable that some of those congressional staffers or journalists in the mainstream media who spoke with their conscience during the genocide attended university during these campaigns and were informed on the issue by student activists. And we have to remember the intensity and coordinated nature of Zionist propaganda in the immediate aftermath of October 7th and the onset of Israel's genocide to be reminded of the stakes for these protesters and resignees. Universities are the target then because they're at the core of transforming the debate on various issues, Palestine included. And conditions on the ground in Gaza often challenged Americans to push their solidarity and awareness to new levels. If Americans were more prepared to discuss Gaza as a place whose oppression is rooted in the Nakba, in refugeehood, in dispossession, rather than limiting the focus only on Israel's blockade in 2007 and onwards, which nonetheless is very important, veered understandings of Gaza as a place that suffers from overpopulation and a humanitarian crisis, which could have been caused by anything, even a natural disaster, rather than identifying the root causes. And no single event in the lead up to the Gaza genocide transformed some Americans' understanding of Gaza more than the Great March of Return in 2018 and 2019. The story of Razan al-Najjar and images of maimed youth protesters horrified many in the United States. And for the first time, mainstream media gave space, albeit limited, to nuance and context on Gaza as a place where 2/3 of its population are survivors of descendants of Nakba refugees. Indeed, The word Nakba was properly introduced in this moment and planted the seed for American readiness to absorb these ideas when reintroduced in the context of the endless cycles of displacement that has impacted nearly every family in the Gaza Strip since the start of Israel's genocide. And after decades of intense Zionist propaganda in the United States, this was no easy feat. And this wave of Palestine activism in the mid-2000s and 2010s was institutionalized on a smaller scale. Representative Betty McCollum introduced the first piece of proactive legislation on Palestinian rights in 2017 regarding Israel's kidnapping, detention, and torture of Palestinian children. This bill, which has not been brought to a vote, seeks to amend the Leahy Law, an amendment to the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, to add violence against Palestinian children as a gross violation of human rights, which would condition aid to Israel used for the abuse of Palestinian minors. In 2022, Representative Andre Carson introduced the Justice for Shireen Act, which called for an investigation into Shireen Abu Akleh's assassination while she reported from the Jenin camp. The introduction of legislation like this could not have been possible without decades of Palestine activism. Therefore, it is unfathomable that the wave of protest, criticism of the U.S.-Israel alliance, and support for Palestinians could possibly be reversed. Palestine is a domestic issue because it impacts the limits of civil liberties. And it has for decades. But it was the aftermath of the U.S. protest against the Gaza genocide that finally exposed this reality for the U.S. general public, even if they do not understand it explicitly in these terms. This does not deny the reality that the protest movement will not continue on in the same fashion under Trump. It will take new forms. Organizers will spend time recalibrating. But it is inevitable that this knowledge of Israel's brutality will not leave the American political consciousness. The scenes of Israel's crimes against humanity in Gaza have had irreversible impacts on U.S. public opinion, and there is no return to the status quo of widespread support for Israel amongst the right and left. It is a matter of debate, and it will continue to be, even if repression is used to stifle that debate. And what I have presented here is how Palestine speech was already institutionalized in the United States in the negative sense. And attempts were nonetheless made to institutionalize support for Palestinian rights at the legislative level. What follows in the United States, then, might be better understood this November, but I hope that with this context, we can better understand the role that Palestine has played in American political life. It is a domestic issue, and regardless of the institutional overhaul in the United States, the support for Palestinians cannot be undone and will inevitably manifest in new forms in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our presenters. We appreciate your remarks. Now we have some time for some discussion period, questions. Please avail yourselves to the podiums on the side of the room to present your questions, make remarks. Please. Well, I'm sorry. Oh, we do have. Please.
Is it on?
No. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
you. Thank you for all the presentations. Question to Yousef. The coalition that you're talking about, it seems to me there are 2 points that can cut across right and left. One is the attack on constitutional rights, especially free speech. Number 2, and I think more importantly, the idea that support for Israel is hurting ordinary Americans, whether it's economics or healthcare and so on. And you know, I appreciate you and others have raised the point that the support on the left is largely value-based, and that's certainly true, but also on the left there's a strong tradition of US dollars going to military-industrial complex or taken away from education, healthcare, and so on. So, which I think is necessary for a broad base on the left to join in. My question is, you know, that kind of coalition around these 2 points is not going to just happen naturally. So is there an advocacy effort, an organized advocacy effort, you know, to start to generate that kind of coalition, you know, with facts and easily digestible sort of figures and information that people can sort of wrap their heads around this? And number 2, what are the obstacles standing in delivering that message? I'm thinking specifically especially on the right, the Republican leadership if something like this starts to grow, they could respond by saying, actually, our relationship with Israel is about making us richer, and you should support us for that. They haven't made that argument yet, but we've seen Trump just make it with Venezuela. You know, when he stood next to Lindsey Graham and Lindsey's trying to do the old neocon talking points, and Trump is like, no, we're taking their oil. And people were laughing at that, but Trump actually understood the base better than Lindsey Graham and knew that without saying that, he wouldn't have the base support him, and the base did support him on that because he said that. So what are the possibility that could happen as well for Israel, which might then lose the right once again, because it's I think for me that it's clear that the right is only interested in that point, and the free speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Can I ask another question and then or you want to answer?
If we may just simply deal with the questions one at a time. We have some time. It's okay. Please go ahead.
I appreciate the question, Mohanad. So one thing I want to, and I tried to make this point a little bit in the opening that we're seeing today on the right was, I think, really hard to imagine just a few years ago. Okay, as I noted in my comments, when we began to see openings on the left, public opinion on the right went in the opposite direction. We saw a very significant partisan divide, right? As the left was moving to be more critical of Israel, the right was just embracing Israel harder, right? So this meant that the space to do any kind of advocacy around Palestine, while it was opening a little bit more on the left, it was totally closed on the right. Because of this, I think there hasn't been a lot of long-term planning for this kind of moment, right? So it's not that this is something that was foreseen. And I think the speed in which it happened, and of course the genocide had a lot to do with how quickly things began to move, right? Caught a lot of people by surprise. I think people are starting to adjust to this reality, right? And there is work going on to try to build relationships across this divide. But as I noted, it's treacherous territory, right? There are a lot of challenges. The Palestine advocacy space has spent a lot of time focused on living in and among and speaking to the left. There is a certain language, there's a set of priorities, there's a framework that has become normal in the course of this advocacy that doesn't work on the right. So there's going to be a steep learning curve there. And while I think it's happening, I'm sure it's not happening as fast as we would all like to see, right? But I think it's definitely underway. And I think the things that you point to are correct. And I think it's starting to happen now, whether through you know, sort of intentional agitation or people just kind of opening their eyes to the reality that, you know, Israel's a fairly wealthy country. Why are they getting billions of dollars in handouts from the United States? Why do Israelis have a robust social welfare system in comparison to Americans, but they're still taking American handouts for weapons? And this idea that somehow, you know, Israel is making the United States richer, I don't think that most Americans buy that. I think they're much more likely to buy the idea that Israel is a burden. And when you start totaling up the amount of money, not just in terms of what comes from the U.S. taxpayers' pocket, but in terms of direct sort of contributions, right, to Israel, but also in terms of military spending in defense of Israel. It's a really significant amount of money. So those conversations are happening, and I think this is an area that you're right to identify as a place where a wide range of people across the spectrum would get animated around.
Hello? Hello? Yeah. Abdel Hamid Siam. I'm from New Jersey. I teach at Rutgers University. And I've been involved with this movement of supporting the Palestinian question for many years, as some of you know. I am fearful at this moment to lose this momentum. Hundreds of thousands of people who went to the streets during the last 2 years. But there are two obstacles now. First, there are some laws now criminalize who support Palestinians, especially in universities, as you eloquently explained. And the second, we don't have an umbrella organization in the US to bring together all Palestinian and Arab activists to create a central lobby similar to AIPAC. In the last 2 years, I have been speaking in many places in America how important to create some organization to cultivate all these kind of support to the Palestinian cause. We need to keep those, especially celebrities who express their support, journalists, actors, actresses, singers, sports people who express their support to Palestinians. How can we maintain them? How can we keep that momentum? How can we bring them together and keep them? I am fearful that we might lose it for these two reasons, because our opponents are not sleeping also. There are laws. There are criminalized who support Palestinians. Many professors lost their jobs. Many news broadcasters lost their jobs. So there are some who are paying a heavy price for supporting the Palestinians. If they don't find the other side willing to embrace them and bring them and keep them and maintain them and support them, we might lose them. How can we address those two issues? To create a pan-Arab, pan-Palestinian lobby group in the US, and to maintain that momentum that we have seen the last 2 years. Thank you. And the question is addressed to all of you. Thank you.
It's Jahshan to answer.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much for this important question, and thank you for your contribution. I mean, your activities over the years have been very helpful to the Palestinian cause and to Arab causes in the United States, definitely, particularly in your area of the country. This question has been recurring over the years. As I hate to reveal my age here, but after 50 years of involvement in Arab American politics, this is not the first time this sense of urgency that you feel has been shared by fellow Arab Americans and Muslim Americans over the years on many occasions. As you know, back in 1970s, early 70s, that question preoccupied the leaders of the Arab American community, and as a result of that, several organizations emerged, including one specifically focused on what you suggested, a pan-Arab entity that caters to like lobbying on behalf of Arab Americans, with of course the Palestine issue being on top of the agenda. And that was at the time the National Association of Arab Americans, which I headed for quite a few years. But then unfortunately, the cyclical nature of both American and, as such, Arab American politics tend to impact our organizations. Organizations tend to have a lifespan. And with intervening variables, both crackdowns like right now, my colleague mentioned, for example, the Boulder operation, the crackdown that affected us when I was directing the AAUG office way back in 1980s, early 80s, and how our membership, particularly our academic students and faculty, were affected by that. And similar pattern is emerging right now. And number two, unfortunately, the lack of coordination, and two, the animosity that emerged between Arab American agenda and Arab official agenda, and that contributed to the demise of organizations like, for example, NAAA, and the disappearance of support for it. The community, unfortunately, hasn't been able, historically, that's one of the main reasons, to support these types of organizations for two reasons: financial support and manpower support, or woman power support. Financial support in terms of, it takes about $2 to $3 million a year, from my experience, to have a basic lobbying group. Some lobbies, their budgets are closer to $100 plus million, like in terms of APAC, for example, and so on. So basically, you need a sizable sum of money. The communities on their own, even though the community has become rich, and I've always advocated internally within the community, if we could have 1,000 Arab Americans, there is more than that who are millionaires, by the way, that to contribute $1,000 each. 1,000 to contribute 1,000. You could have the seed money of 1 million to proceed at this time, but this hasn't caught the imagination of the community at this stage. The other one is lobbies require discipline. Requires discipline in terms of voting, requires discipline in terms of support. If you were to head one of these organizations and you tell our members across the country, support so-and-so, or vote for so-and-so, and they don't, you're not going to last. That's basically what has happened in the past. So I agree with you, it is time to reconsider, because we are at that cycle, and I do share your sense of urgency, that I'm afraid that whatever we have at this point as a result of the war in Gaza, the credit goes to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, particularly those who lost their lives and paid for this gain, if you will, in what Yousef described and Hanna described and Tamara described. It could be rolled back, yeah, it could be rolled back. So how do we tap that? I think that's the challenge for Arab and Muslim Americans who are not necessarily working together to rectify this question at this time.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, just
one
to add one thing to that, Khalil. I understand where the concern comes from, particularly after we saw the demonstrations that we saw, the mobilization that we saw, and now we see in this moment the intense repression and so on. But I don't think we should underestimate the impact that experience is going to have on an entire generation of Americans who became radicalized at that time, who witnessed the demonstrations, who witnessed their classmates risking arrest during those demonstrations. This is going to be a formative moment in the political identities of a massive chunk of this generation. And that has tremendous potential to change things. I don't disagree that the organizing obviously is important, but I would say that the seeds that were planted at that time, wait for them.
Thank you. Please.
شكرا للمنظمين وشكرا للمتدخلين. عندي سؤالين.
Thank you for the organizers and the speakers. My first question to Ms. Tamara: until the Arabs and Muslims, Latinos, and Americans of African origin be able to withstand what this white Trumpian policies and to reproduce Zohran Mamdani's phenomena, can we generalize this phenomena to the rest of the United States? My question to Mr. Jahshan: you are well known in the Arab and Palestinian activism in America. We in the Arab world know that if it's in the interest of America not to have democratic regimes in the Arab world, but what is the secret in having a president in America who does what he wants? He is the sole person who determines what he wants inside America, outside America, says what he wants, and the rest of us have to accept that I'm president. What happened to all the American institutions and the checks and balances system?
Thank you. I would say Zohran Mamdani's victory in New York City was unprecedented, and it's very significant. Overall, New York City is more progressive than other parts of the United States, and so it's very hard to predict whether this will be translated or reflected in other parts. In general, there is a perception within the Democratic Party that in order for a candidate to win the presidency, you have to appeal to a wide range of perspectives, those on the left, but also those who are moderates, those in the center, and to remain moderate in your views. And I think Zohran Mamdani proved this traditional perception wrong, at least for New York City. It might be, just looking at the opinion polls in the United States, for Democrats at least, this might translate to other parts of the United States. For example, looking at some of the top contenders for the Democratic primaries for the presidency at this time, and this may change over the next few years. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, has toned down her criticism of Israel to some extent, has been very cautious in her remarks, and this is likely a result of advice that if you want to be president, you want to appeal to the centrists as well. I think whether Zohran Mamdani's victory will be seen in other parts of the country in the midterms and the presidential elections will be a very consequential point for the United States, and it will change US politics and arguably the world.
بالنسبة للسؤال الثاني.
With regard to the second question, undoubtedly, there are so many lessons that we can learn and that we can talk about and that take into account
نجاحه حتى الآن في تغيير النظام الأمريكي، ولا أعتقد أنه انتهى. سنرى المزيد من التغييرات السلبية إجمالا.
changes and this is going to impact the internal and external contexts. What is surprising, what is surprising here, as I have insinuated in the question, how can a state of institutions, a great power, and a country that has exercised democracy for many years, how can it all of a sudden concede to a person such as this one and start dismantling to some extent one whole history? The United States of America, as we all know, we're talking about 47 presidents in the history of the United States of America, amongst whom there are so many presidents who have achieved a great deal and many others who have not been productive. On the contrary, they have even been bad, but we have not seen or witnessed in the history of the United States of America a president as concerning as this one. As I have insinuated in my question, in actual fact, Trump is not a politician, and he has proven something. In actual fact, there are many, many books that were authored about this particular topic, which is the vulnerability of the American system. It was proven, and the wrong impression that we had there, and those who have studied the American system, who have taught the American system for many years, we used to think that this regime, this system, had had many strong bases, and it has never detached itself from the democratic system and never accepted an authoritarian person to rule. But Trump has proven that these conclusions were wrong and these ideas that we had in mind were wrong. The United States of America has proven that it is a vulnerable system and that all these achievements in the last 244 plus years, I think 248 years, can be reversed. A country that is democratic can no longer be that. So the institutions do not face the same impact compared to the other vulnerable institutions. But in actual fact, what helped Trump is in actual fact is the fact that there is a large majority. I do not think that it is a majority, but we're talking about that has felt throughout the American history that it is marginalized and nobody took it seriously. And as a result of that, Trump came as a leader to support a segment of the community. He found a racist component, extreme right component of the community that felt that it was unjustly marginalized and it wants to take revenge. So we have a kind of a marriage of interest between Trump and MAGA, which is Make America Great Again. So they needed a leader, and irrespective to the fact that he is not part of this group, but he knew how he can take advantage of this kind of group who was able to promote their ideas. So this idea did not start with Trump. Make America Great started with Reagan, with the Reagan era, but the traditional Republican Party did not accept or adopt this idea completely, and it was in contradiction with the Republican Party because that Republican Party believed in the traditional system, but when it was splintered, Trump used MAGA to reinstate this concept once again, and this is what we see as a result of the change on the ground. Microphone, please. نطلب من السيد أشرف صديق استخدام الميكروفون.
As you mentioned just now, that to make America great as a democratic country or as an empire in the world. Second, that recent aggressive continued policies, I will say, in that region, I could understand of, say, creating a fear of war or threat, Iran and in the region. I was of the opinion that once the region agrees on Abraham Accord and also maybe some share in the resources for the American empire, it will be meeting the thirst of Mr. Trump. But I was of the opinion that there won't be any attack on Iran. And there it was a camouflage, what I understand, as started from Palestine, 70, 80 years before, now going to Venezuela, coming back to Europe. It was a kind of camouflage to quietly capture Gaza. My question is, what do you think, and also the general public over there, is it a temporary, their policy to run the government in Gaza, or it will be a part of White House or Mr. Trump family? Thank you.
Yeah, we might turn into a kingdom soon, and we might see another Trump down the road. I'm just kidding. I hope not. Should I?
Please.
Okay. Basically, yeah, I mean, you're right that there is this tendency, particularly among the current political base, that Mr. Trump essentially leads and used to take over the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is no longer, as a matter of fact. I mean, we heard about the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party also disappeared on us. There is no Republican Party like let's say, the Gerald Ford, the Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, the Scowcroft, the Jim Baker. Republican Party is gone. This is a totally different party. It's the MAGA party. It's a Trumpite party. My guess, personally, as a student of American politics for many years, I would say Trump is a passing phase, if you're asking what is passing and what is staying out of this. Trump is a passing phase. Now, in his remaining 3 years, if Trump doesn't necessarily diffuse or alienate totally that MAGA base will stay. So the problem will not be resolved because that is already kind of semi-institutionalized in American politics in the format of Christian nationalism, American nationalism, in a different version than we have seen historically. It's not the first time in American history that we see that, but this time it's much more pronounced, and it has a large base. We're talking about, I don't know, 70 to 80 million people out of 244 or so million population. So it is a solid base. It's not going to disappear unless somehow it's either diffused and it kind of dissipates on its own, or some of its demands are met, or what is happening right now, the seeds of conflict are emerging within it. That could be its own self-destruction, which is, of course, instigated by different issues, but it does involve Palestine and Israel. You have major figures in the movement are discovering that Trump is not one of them. They wanted him to end useless wars that last forever. He is already engaged, already hit 8 countries, bombed 8 countries. He claims to have made peace in 9. So it's a good balance. Peace in 9, war in 8. But I don't think so, because I don't accept his logic that he solved 8 or 9 conflicts. So I would say that in terms of the ideas that propelled Trump forward, some of it is going to stay with us for generations. In terms of Trump himself, the Trumpist politics, that authoritarian mindset of his, and irreverent approach, I don't think it's going to last. The U.S. over the next couple of years will pay enough price for his mistakes that it will retreat and be more careful next time they vote. Yeah.
If I may, there's a principle in the historiography of imperialism that empire is not worth having if it cannot be had on the cheap. So empires tend to prefer indirect rule as opposed to direct rule. And it does seem that the ultimate goal of something like Trump's Board of Peace is eventually a system of indirect rule. And there's a feeling that the United States has lost control of this, and it's Trump's role to restore that. Now, Trump will argue that other people are footing the bill. There's a $1 billion barrier to entry to this Board of Peace. But we should keep this in mind, that the ultimate goal is to restore a system of indirect rule rather than day-to-day management, which has been established to a certain, or is being attempted to a certain extent. And we should also remember that there's precedent for precisely this indirect rule. It's the reason why the Palestinian body politic was already fragmented between the West Bank and Gaza. This has very much to do with US foreign policy demands at that time. So it does seem that what Trump puts in place, you had mentioned the Abraham Accords, is never reversed by successive administrations. In fact, Biden sought to perhaps expand the Abraham Accords, not oppose them. And so while there's condemnation of the vulgarity of Trump, of the ways in which he looks to expand this sort of influence, the principles themselves never seem to quite go away. They're just simply repackaged.
Let me just conclude with just one slight addition to that in answering your question. As you know, Trump loves to do these executive orders. He did about 220 during his first term. He already did 226 in the first year of his second term. These are diktats. He feels like God giving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Those will be very difficult to repeal. Many of them will stay with us for a long time to come.
Well, we have come to the end of our time, allotted time. Thank you very much for being here, for contributing questions. Thanks for the panelists for very, very good remarks. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I welcome you to the second session, Dr. Azmi Bishara's lecture at 6 o'clock. We'll see you then. Thank you very much.